Hi, I'm Dubber. I'm the Director of Music Tech Fest. Thanks so much for listening to the MTF podcast. Now, we're going to go a little off script today. Normally, you'll hear interviews actually conducted on stage at MTF on the podcast. However, as it happens, I'm in New York right now representing MTF on a project with the Swedish consulate over here, as well as Swedish Music Export and the Swedish Institute, introducing some fantastic artists from Sweden, obviously, to US press and music industries. Now, since I'm over here, I took a bit of time out to catch up with a couple of old friends that I haven't seen since my last visit to New York, and it's been a while, including an incredible musician by the name of Dee Jackson. I thought since we were having a chat, it would be nice to capture some of that and make a podcast out of it, and I'm really glad I did. We talked everything from children's TV to avant-garde jazz, orchestral arrangements, music education, The Tonight Show, and the music of Prince. It was an absolute pleasure to spend a bit of time with Dee. Have a listen, and I'm sure you'll see why. Enjoy. So I'm sitting here with Dee Jackson, who's an internationally respected and renowned pianist. I want to say jazz pianist, but
Right.
You're more than a jazz pianist because you do a lot of classical music as well.
Well, yeah, I've actually shifted gears since we last talked, because I interviewed you for my podcast many years ago. We were just trying to decide how long ago it was. It might have been 10 years ago or something.
A decade.
Yeah. And since then, I've also been writing a lot of music for media and getting much more involved directly in technology. And I actually won an Emmy Award for the first time a couple of years ago, which was
congratulations
exciting.
on that.
Thank you. Yeah, and just doing a lot of things, with technology more directly. But I'm directing a jazz program here at Brooklyn College, the Global Jazz Masters program. So certainly very heavily involved in that as well.
Fantastic. Can we just name drop very briefly the kind of people that you've worked with?
I really got associated with this sort of post-loft jazz group of musicians, and they kind of embraced me when I was younger. People like David Murray of the World Saxophone Quartet, the late Hammett Blewett, which is very sad. He just passed away recently. A great, world-class originator on the baritone saxophone, and then slightly younger people like James Carter and other loft players like Billy Bang, and I've played with so many different people. I've actually been working a lot with the Roots now, who are certainly not jazz musicians per se, but who actually have a surprising background in sort of avant-garde jazz.
Okay, sorry, what are you doing with the Roots?
I've done a lot of stuff with them, actually, over the last several years, from performing with them at Radio City Music Hall in Madison Square Garden, including some orchestral arrangements I wrote of their pieces for the Radio City Music Hall performance. I was recently working a little bit more in kind of a back room capacity, playing the piano and arranging, writing out charts and things like that for Tariq, who's working on a Broadway-bound musical that nobody knows about yet, so I'm not going to mention the name of it. I just did a bunch of symphonic Prince arrangements. There's a tour of Prince
we're going
music.
to talk about that.
Yeah, going on, and I was asked to do that also by Questlove, and I conducted them on The Tonight Show a year ago, an arrangement I did for them, and did the arrangements on the last couple of CDs for strings, and played a little piano. So a lot of just whenever they call me, it's sort of like getting sucked into this cool universe from my normal sitting in front of a computer or teaching life, and having kind of access to this kind of very cool, glamorous realm for 5 seconds, and then I go back to my relatively normal life in comparison afterwards.
Sure. Because if Wikipedia is to be believed, you sort of stopped working in 2007.
Apparently so, yes. Clearly I'm not observing Wikipedia that much or updating it, apparently, secretly.
But those were your jazz albums kind of on... It was Just in Time, and
yes.
What was the other label?
I was on a major label, on BMG, for a couple of CDs. I had my little major label moment for a minute as well.
And these are sort of headline releases with your name on the cover.
Yeah. So I did about 12 CDs total, either as leader or co-leader. I had a co-led group, one of which was with Hammett Blewett and Moore Chalmers, Senecalese djembe player. And yeah, just all my own original music and so on. But you're right, yeah, I stopped recording in 2007, and since then I've kind of made that kind of interesting, to me at least, left turn into writing for media, writing even children's television, like the Wonder Pets and shows like that are the writing for which are populated tremendously by other jazz musicians who go into it with this, I think, I say biasedly, very open-minded attitude, and just an ability to just do some new conceptual thing every day that they're called upon to do. So yeah, it's been very much that kind of universe that I've been dealing with since. So no real CDs other than soundtrack CDs. I did a movie recently called You and Me, and it was just released in digital media literally today, and also the soundtrack album has just come out today as well. So people check that out. It's a little jazzy, at least.
Yeah, for sure. And so your Emmy, which for international audiences, Emmy means television, right? So,
yes. Yeah.
So it's a soundtrack for a TV show that you won an award for?
Yeah. This children's show called Pig Plus Cat, which was a really surprisingly successful kind of hit show on the PBS network in the States, and won, I think, 7 Emmys total in every possible category, and a very creative children's show where we wrote just any variety of styles of music, and you'd be asked to do it, and then you'd have like 4 days to come up with hip hop meets country or whatever it might be, or classical stuff, and they used real instruments, and it really took the music component very seriously. So we were very happy to win an award in the composition department, essentially.
Right. I'm interested to hear you say real instruments, as if they're sort of they're artificial instruments.
Yeah.
How do you kind of define sort of because we talked very briefly about music tech right at the beginning. What's real and what's not?
Well, it depends on what the intent is. So I guess what I mean really more specifically is whether you're using virtual instruments just for budgetary reasons, or whether you're using them on purpose for what they might offer that would be differentiate themselves from other instruments and so on. So this show, instead of just using virtual that is trying to sound real desperately and not succeeding, which often happens in children's television and in certain cases elsewhere, they really make a point to make sure that anything that's supposed to sound like a real instrument, they actually use a real drummer and a bass player and a guitar player and a couple of horns each episode and that kind of thing. So it's something that they're quite proud of and that we think has made a difference. The Wonder Pets, similarly, I wrote for that show a few episodes, and they used to crowd a whole orchestra into their South Street Seaport studio. It was at least 20 some odd, 25, 27 musicians or something, and they might sweeten it with MIDI, but it was fundamentally real for the most part as well.
So what's your approach to, let's say, technology, production wise? Do you have a particular recording setup that you use? Do you have
Yeah. I mean, I'm still, I spend a lot of time, hours in front of my computer. I use Logic Pro as my main kind of DAW or DAW. And for notation, I've been using increasingly Dorico, which I think is the future for that category, and may very well overlap with DAW functionality as well. I've just been slowly building up, as I'm sure everybody does who's in this kind of field, a library of what I consider hopefully the best sounding thing in every category, at least as far as acoustic emulation possible, in order to do very fully realized mock-ups, and in many cases use that as the finished product as well. So that part is not terribly unusual. I have a studio. It's right off of my bedroom in this house that we moved to outside of New York City in Maplewood. And one of the requirements when we were house hunting was to find a house that would have a mysterious room that was unused that I could actually use to make it into my studio. So I was looking at attics and basements, and we came to this house, and there was this giant room adjacent to the master bedroom. And I can't, for the life of me, understand what it would have been used for, because you'd have to go through the bedroom to get to this enormous room. It wasn't a walk-in closet, maybe a baby room or something. So we saw that, and I'm like, okay, we're going to move to this house, basically. And that's become essentially my studio.
And grand piano in the center? Is that
No, I would like. I've actually done full recordings, including the soundtrack album for this film, You and Me. It was a lot of solo piano. And I actually admittedly, and perhaps shamefully, used the Ivory plugin, instead of an actual instrument, because it's gotten to the point where, to me, I can make that sound a lot better than any other real-world piano I might want to try to have access to. For my CDs, I was a Bosendorfer artist, so they would kind of ship in the $150,000 Bosendorfer Imperial Grand, but for my film projects, not quite as practical to do that. So it works out quite well.
Right, sure. So you perform live in front of a grand piano most of the time? Yeah,
when I do play live, I try to insist and use the real thing. Again, it's always a question of the intent. So if I'm trying to make it a real thing, then I want a real piano. And if I'm trying to mess with some other stuff and merge hybrid textures, then I'll use something else.
Because that's a phenomenal piece of technology in its own right.
What, the piano?
The piano.
Yeah, one of the first, really, in a certain way, in terms of resonating with the culture.
It's amazing. So, okay, the Prince thing.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, the Prince estate, after Prince died, they basically sanctioned Questlove or Amir, as we call him, Amir Thompson, to curate a whole program of his music arranged for full orchestra. And so I wasn't the only person called up, but he called me up, and he just gradually gave me more to do, I guess because I kept, getting it done or whatever. So I ended up doing about 9 arrangements, including a lot of some of his tunes that were from Parade. They were a little more obscure, as well as like Purple Rain and things like that, which I had, I think, less than 24 hours to do. And he was like, arrange Purple Rain. He asked me at 5 p.m. and I needed to like hand in the charts for the orchestra first thing the next morning or something. And it was this long, 13-minute arrangement of it and so on. But yeah, so I just did these arrangements, partially inspired by his own kind of MIDI sessions, and mocked them up using Dorico. It was actually the first time I used that new program, which I think is excellent for notation. And
when you say his own MIDI sessions, you're saying Prince's MIDI sessions?
I should clarify. No, not Prince's MIDI sessions, but actually Questlove's MIDI sessions. So they have the Roots basically have a whole dressing room that they have souped up essentially to become a recording studio backstage at the Tonight Show, where of course they're the house band there. And so any projects that I've done with them, they basically use that for rehearsal. They have an on-call engineer, an excellent engineer named Stephen Mandel, who basically records everything they ever did. Like the theme song, all of the walk-on music, everything is just recorded. They do edits, they voice over to tell you what they want, and then by the time you leave the rehearsal, Stephen will edit something and tell you exactly what he wants to do. So for the Prince arrangements, they just apparently got together and they just started jamming and adding different keyboard textures, and I had to kind of extrapolate what they gave me and by ear and to kind of blow it up for orchestra and then add my 2 cents and all the normal stuff one might do for orchestration and arranging gigs.
Kind of a dream gig, really.
It was a lot of fun other than the deadline, because it was like 9 charts in a week or something like that, that I had to fully arrange or based upon what they gave me, and then tweak and orchestrate and then notate and make look nice, because I didn't have enough time basically to hire a copyist or something. So it was tiring, but it was very exciting. I went and saw the performance at the King Centre. Actually, they're coming to London. I think their last performance after having toured like 50 cities mostly in the US, but also across Europe most recently, will be at the Royal Albert Hall next week in London. So that'll be a lot of fun.
Wow. And they're not straightforward pop songs either, are they?
No, they're all very quirky, and as is typical of Questlove, they always want to put like a left brain or not a left-handed turn kind of spin on things. They hired me also to do the theme song for Detroit, this Catherine Bigelow film. They wanted to present it for the first time on the Tonight Show, and. But as was typical of the Roots, they did not want to just do the version that was on the CD, which was already a fantastic version. It was already very cool. They'd gone into this sort of retro 60s style studio in Long Island City in Queens, and used all authentic 8-track machines and that kind of mic with the 2 sides recording into mono at the same time for the 2 horns and all of that. So it was already very hip and very retro combined with hip hop. But they wanted to completely blow it up and do something different. So again, I went to the Tonight Show backstage, and Steve Mandel recorded, and Questlove talked over it and said, do this and try this. And so I completely, reworked it a little bit and conducted it on the Tonight Show as well. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff that I've done with them. Whenever they need something that's a little quirky, I think I'm like their avant-garde, pseudo-jazzy guy that, they hire to kind of go in and do some interesting spin on something that they've already done. Yeah,
seems like they wouldn't be that intimidated by an avant-garde jazzy guy, though.
No, I mean, in fact, their late manager, sadly, and producer, essentially, Richard Nichols, who was really kind of very simpatico, or kind of like 2 sides of the same coin with Questlove, really. They just became one entity, even though nobody knew about this guy, this man behind the curtain. But he used to be a radio avant-garde DJ in Philadelphia, and he would play all of the kind of music of the people it turns out that I've since started to play with, like all the world saxophone guys, and he was just a fan of the post-70s loft jazz scene and beyond. And Questlove heard him on the radio before they had formed the Roots, and he was so enamored of the music he was hearing that he started to record this DJ's time when he was on the air and all the music he was playing. And then Questlove and Richard Nichols at one point finally met, and among the things that came up was Questlove was like, man, you got to check out this DJ, I've been recording this stuff, and check this out. And Richard was like, well, that was me, and so a friendship was formed, and they went on to form the Roots, essentially. Yeah.
Tell me about where we are right now.
We are in a rather old room. Oh, you mean we're actually at Brooklyn College, the main campus of Brooklyn College, and I recently started teaching here after teaching at Hunter College for many years, more as an adjunct. This job I'm doing now is technically a bit more kind of like a full-time job, even though it doesn't thankfully take up the entire week, so I can still do a lot of outside projects as we've been talking about. But yeah, so I've been hired here to help run their Global Jazz Masters program. But they also have a separate facility called the Fierstein Graduate School of Cinema, which is located right on a movie studio lot, one of the few like big movie studio lots on the East Coast, Steiner Studios, right in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a bit of a ways from here by subway. And so I'm teaching media scoring there. So here I come here on Tuesdays and teach jazz, essentially. We're, as I mentioned, doing a big final concert tonight of my own compositions and some Global Jazz Masters originals as well. And then tomorrow at I think it's 6 in the morning, it turns out tomorrow I have to get up and drive into Fierstein and teach, media scoring and studio recording techniques and things like that.
So is the teaching a kind of is that something that all prominent jazz musicians end up doing, or is it?
Not all. I mean, I went through an early phase. Actually, when we were talking, I might have been on the tail end of the phase where I was really trying to get out and tour and, go all over the world, as I, thankfully subsequently ended up doing, certainly as a sideman and then ultimately as a leader. But, life goes in phases. And there was a point where I started having a family. I wanted to settle down. It happened to coincide with all of the new technologies and music that had been kind of finally getting more accessible and frankly affordable. So it was a good time for me to dive more into music tech. I think, again, when I met you, I was just kind of beginning that whole process, and that led to me kind of really giving up being on the road regularly. I go out every once in a while when I'm asked to, and just spend a lot of time writing for media. And in a weird way, this teaching thing has become almost like yet another kind of third phase where I'm being called upon more regularly to do it and really be part of an academic program for the first time. So it's exciting for me. I love mixing things up, even project to project, but even just, life-wise or music career-wise, every few years, kind of refresh things and try something new. And it's essentially what's going on right now.
Because I remember when we met, I've been blogging for 2 or 3 years at the time and writing stuff and putting it online, and then suddenly out of the blue, somebody I'd heard of was getting in touch and saying, can we meet up?
That's right. Yeah.
Which is fascinating. I mean, because your interest, because I was writing about music and technology and the internet for independent musicians and so on. But you obviously had a thirst for that and an interest in that way early. Where did that come from?
I mean, I was always flirting with a fascination with technology. If anything, I really had to avoid dealing with it too soon because I knew I would just never become a jazz musician at the time, because I knew I was just such a tech person and so into that. I was into, earlier analog keyboards, which ironically to me, or humorously maybe to me, have become like cool retro things now. That studio where I was doing some work with the Roots, that kind of retro studio that was kind of modeled after, as I was saying, like 8-track tape machine, all the 60s kind of technology. I think there was a Juno 106 there, and that was like one of my first synthesizers. Yeah. And I'm like, well, this was like in my father's place under my bed back at home now. Yeah. But now it's considered cool, even like the M1 and all those things. And
not just cool, but expensive.
And expensive, and desirable. So I did, I was into it early on, but then I really became very serious about first classical piano, then jazz. And again, when technology became accessible, and right around the time I met you a couple of years before, I just dived in whole cloth and started to really get into that world very much, and have really never stopped.
Because you were on the internet more than most of your peers.
Yeah. It's funny, I still remember the old, not to completely date myself, but the old Rec Music Blue Note news group, you know?
Yeah.
And
Newsnet.
Yeah, exactly. And I used to, in fact, not too long ago, I was curious, and I was like, I was definitely posting when at the dawn of the internet. Yet another parallel with this sort of desire for people to go back and be nostalgic for what was happening back then. My son, who's 12 now, is all over Reddit. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, that's basically Usenet all over again. And he's trying to explain, well, you can go and post things to discussion groups and people will, respond to you. And I think that's kind of old school.
Yeah, BBS forum, we've done that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, not to mention, of course, somewhat tangentially related, like, there's the show Stranger Things, on Netflix, which is all about 80s culture. So now my son is totally into 80s music. So he's basically listening to the same music that I was listening to when I was his age, and introducing some of it like, hey, man, Dad, you should check out Sting. And I'm like, okay, I'm kind of already familiar with the dude and, and all of that. So, it's pretty fascinating how things come around.
And how did you come across my stuff? Just out of
You had that book, wasn't it? It was like 25 things you have to do, or what was it? The new music.
20 things you must know about
new music
online.
strategies.
Yeah, new music strategies with the blog.
I love that. I fell in love with all of those things in terms of all of the advice that you gave me, and then that kind of brought me on a rabbit hole of following all the different activities that you had done. And I forget where we were at the, in terms of the chronology of what you've done since at that stage. And I'm trying to remember, I should review the podcast. Maybe for research for this meeting, I should have reviewed our interview from 10 years ago. I forget what we even talked about. Yeah, but I just remember we were just talking about technology and sample libraries and different things.
But you went straight into making a podcast. I mean, really early on. Podcasting, I think the first podcast was like late 2004, early 2005.
Yeah.
And you were already on it 2006.
That's true. And it was weird because it was a lot harder more recently. Like, I admire anybody who does one now because there's so many of them. I tried another one recently and I was like, I'm, like 50 people listening and stuff because it's harder. But back then you could get like a couple thousand plus people immediately just because you were the only person doing it. So I might have had one of the first jazz podcasts, perhaps, I don't know, or jazz related podcasts. And it was actually part of Artist Share. I think maybe we talked about that too, which was sort of a early, Kickstarter type technology. It's still around, but of course since then we've had all of these other similar things that have taken off. So that was also rather unique at the time.
So what's next?
Oh man, I don't know. I think I was talking to somebody about this recently that career-wise, and maybe it's because you have a family and it gives you a different perspective on that kind of urgency of having to just frantically make it and do something different. But I have to say that when I was a jazz musician, I was very almost to the point of obnoxiousness directed. I'm probably of the point of obnoxiousness to other people besides myself, because it had probably appeared like, who is this guy? Why is he so hungry for success or trying to get out there and having opportunities to play and all of that? So since then, I realized that I've kind of been very maybe weirdly open to things that come my way, and it's actually worked out okay. Knock on wood. I mean, if you look at what I've done, it's the things don't always seem to have like a direct connection to each other, and yet I always feel like there's a through line between them all. Maybe it's just that they're all my own thing, and I'm trying to bring whatever it is that I'm about to all of those different projects, no matter how eclectic they may seem, from avant-garde jazz to children's television or writing for the Roots or teaching or whatever it might be. And I think going forward, I have the goal to kind of keep that kind of mentality open. I'm certainly enjoying what I'm doing right now at Brooklyn College. So the immediate future, I want to help build this program and really create a master's degree, which is what it's focused on, that does not teach jazz in the conventional way, which is more, scale chord relationships and like a strict adherence to tradition and all of that, and really kind of imbue it with the same, hopefully, not to be too presumptuous, but kind of conceptual open-mindedness that I've tried to bring to not only what I've done as a jazz musician, but everything that I've tried to do, musically speaking, and really kind of encourage that. I mean, to me, that's very exciting to have the opportunity to push that. And it's also considered global jazz because we want to incorporate other ways of conceptually thinking, including borrowing from other world cultures and things like that. So that's sort of on the immediate radar, but I also want to continue certainly writing for media. There's a few projects, in process now that I'm not allowed to talk about, but are based upon some children's stuff and some other projects that I'm kind of in line to be involved in shortly. And I would like to, now that I'm teaching more jazz after many years, not emphasizing it quite as much, I would like to perform more. And after our president, whose name shall go unmentioned, because you can go into a room and say his name and close the door, and then people will just be angry and fighting and talking for 2 years after that. But the president, whose name will go unmentioned, he right after he was elected, I, like maybe many other artists, was so frustrated and wanting to vent, and so I basically wrote about an album's worth of music ready to go. I have one tune called DFT, so don't fucking try, just stuff like that, where I just wanted to get things off my chest. So I would like to, at some point, hopefully relatively soon, record this album and just kind of get that out there as well. So a few different things.
One more thing to add to your list of things to do in the near future is let's get you to a Music Tech Fest.
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Yeah,
I would love to do that.
Thanks so much for doing this today.
Thank you. Yeah, great to see you again.
All right, cheers.
All right.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the MTF podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, and so on. And if you can think of someone else who might like it, send them a link. Much appreciated, and talk soon. Cheers.